Unit 1. Chapter 1. North America was fundamentally shaped by the Ice Age, which constantly changed its geography. People first entered the Americas over the Bering Land Bridge and went either through the Pacific Coastal Route or the Bering Land Bridge route. These people became the Native Americans, who created their own advanced civilizations and cultures, and spread from North America all the way down to the bottom end of South America. Meanwhile, in Europe, several efforts were being made to expand their horizons. The Norse were the first to make contact with North America, and the Europeans also entered Africa in an attempt to find a way to India. One of these explorers was named Christopher Columbus, and he came up with the brilliant idea of sailing to the west to try and get east. But instead of finding India, he ran into the New World. Let's see here. Alright. Then, the two worlds, the Native Americans, who were already entrenched in North America, and Europe, collided. The Spanish conquistadores went and killed everyone, either with guns, cannons, and swords, or with diseases, and slowly but surely, Mexico, Peru, and all of the great American civilizations were smashed under the European conquerors. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. English colonization of the New World was made possible by Elizabeth I, who instilled a great sense of nationalism within England, in part by defeating the Spanish Armada. This paved the way for England to dominate the Atlantic Ocean and begin to expand west. Their first attempts at colonization were complete and utter failures. However, their next few attempts, including Jamestown, were also failures, but they were failures that lasted. Jamestown itself still exists in modern times. The English constantly clashed with the Native Americans that were near their colonies. Their desire for land for tobacco plantations made these conflicts inevitable. However, the natives were eventually pushed back, and Virginia was able to be formed and became the child of tobacco, in that tobacco was its sole cash crop. Now, in addition to this, another colony, Maryland, was formed in a similar way, except it was formed to be a Catholic haven by the First Lord Baltimore. The West Indies were another British colony, except their main social problem was that they really used a lot of slavery. And this would eventually spread to the Carolinas in America, and slavery would become a regular part of the plantation colonies. North Carolina emerged from South Carolina, and Georgia was formed to buffer the rest of the important colonies from Spanish Florida. The plantation colonies were entirely dependent on their cash crops, including but not limited to tobacco, and were reliant upon slavery. Chapter 3. The northern colonies were formed in a very different way. They were founded basically on religious principles, caused primarily by the Protestant Reformation producing Puritanism. This caused the Pilgrims to move to North America and establish Plymouth Colony, which was eventually incorporated into the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and all of these colonies were very religious. Roger Williams founded Rhode Island in an attempt to provide refuge for those who disagreed with the inhabitants of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. However, King Charles was eventually able to exert his power over most of the colonies and turned most of them into royal colonies. The Netherlands attempted to set up Dutch colonies in New York, but failed after several conflicts with the Swedish and the English, which the English won. William Penn established his colony, Pennsylvania, and most of the New England and Middle colonies were established either by these colonies or by expansions of these colonies. Chapter 4. American life in the 17th century. Many of the southern colonies, being dependent upon tobacco as their primary cash crop created a very elaborate tobacco colony, which was almost entirely dependent on indentured servants who eventually revolted during Bacon's Rebellion, which made them very unreliable as a work source. So they switched to slavery, which caused a great migration and the African diaspora in the New World. Africans in America were usually slaves, however some of them were able to acquire their freedom. Southern society was split up into the exceedingly wealthy and the exceedingly poor, which was not a very healthy way of having a society. New England society, on the other hand, was actually very different. It was much more unified, much more religious, and was much healthier. It was much more democratic than the South and much more equal, as opposed to the South, which had a very diverse, and you were either rich or you were not rich at all. The New England was much more balanced, and as such, their families were much easier to maintain, since there were fewer people who couldn't afford to have families. Life in New England town was actually rather democratic, and town meetings determined a lot of the policies of the local towns. However, due to their religious near-fanaticism, the Puritans who lived in Plymouth and the Massachusetts Bay Colony and other New England colonies were very fearful of the devil in every way, and as such the Salem witch trials was an expression of their fear of the changing social status which came from them going from these small colonies of insignificance to these great colonies who were beginning to be incorporated into the royal colonial system. The New England way of life was healthier, with ownership of land being primarily determined by towns, and the early settlers' days and ways varied widely depending on if you lived in New England or in the South, whereas the middle colonies were sort of a balance between the two, more diversity than the North, less diversity than the South. Chapter 5. America was becoming an increasingly diverse place. Along with the original English settlers, there were also German settlers who brought their knowledge of industry to the Americas, Scots-Irish settlers who brought their sense of survival in hills and woods, and African Americans who were either slaves or free people in rare cases. Doctors, lawyers, and other professionals were usually trained in England or from there. Tobacco and other cash crops were still the primary methods of earning money in the Americas, and they were critically important to the American economy. Roads were not very sophisticated, and most of the highways were, as you can see. The Great Awakening occurred, in which America and the rest of the world received a great religious revival. Colleges like William and Mary were established, and the printing press was used widely at this time. Chapter 6. King Louis XIV was the French monarch and encouraged French nationalism and colonialism. He helped to establish New France in Canada, as well as many other French colonies in the New World. These colonies frequently had friendly relationships with nearby Native Americans, but not always. They began to contest with the British in North America, and Major George Washington created the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War in America, where the French and the Indians sided with each other. However, the winner of the French and the Indian War was the British, who absolutely decimated the French and the Indians and took over all of their holdings, after fighting alongside the American militia, who were resentful that they were not appreciated after the war was over. So this is where a source of contention came from later on during the Revolution, was this competition. Chapter 7. The American colonists were beginning to develop a sense of independence. With ideas like republicanism, the radical Whigs were encouraging people to rebel and oppose the British aristocracy, which was trying to control their lives with several acts and taxes, which this mercantilist system dramatically interfered with the colonial economy. The First Continental Congress got together to discuss what to do about these acts and taxes that had been recently passed by the British Parliament, which everyone knew was under the control of the king. The Boston Massacre occurred after disgruntled colonists essentially were violent against the British soldiers nearby, and the Boston Tea Party occurred in similar fashion, except it was to protest the taxes on tea. This would eventually lead to the battles of Lexington and Concord, which would create a long, bloody, hard war. Chapter 8. As war spread across America, the Second Continental Congress drafted George Washington to command the newly formed Continental Army, and he led it to several brilliant defeats. However, he was eventually able to turn the tide when the Hessians went to Trenton and occupied it, and in a brilliant move, he moved his army across the Delaware River and defeated the Hessians at Trenton. Thomas Paine at this point was writing about freedom, and the Congress was releasing the Declaration of Independence. Patriots were pinned against their loyalist brothers in conflict. The Americans were at war with the British and lost most of their battles, until the French came to assist them, and General Burgoyne, the commander-in-chief of the British Army, was defeated at the Battle of Yorktown, which was essentially the end of the war. After this, British were not able to put up resistance to the Americas, and America became its own independent nation. End of Unit 1.